Because time is of the essence. Yes, we're being recorded. Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this in-person policy dialogue organized by the European Policy Center in cooperation with Eulytix on the topic of the imminent elections to the European Parliament, which are scheduled for 6 to 9 of this June. So with only a couple of weeks left until the vote, we wanted to take the opportunity of today's event in order to take stock of the campaign, the electoral campaign so far, and to weigh in on this final stretch with analysis and data on the potential outcome and implications of this round of European elections. Three distinguished panelists, speakers, have kindly agreed to break it all down for us today. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Sophia Russack, who is researcher at CEPS here in Brussels, András Baneth, who is strategic communications expert, best-selling author and entrepreneur, and Levente Kocsis, who is chief data scientist at Eulytix. Thank you all very much for agreeing to contribute to this conversation today. I'm confident that although much has already been said by now and much has been speculated about these elections, our experts still have fresh perspectives to bring forward to you today. Clearly, this is because of their sharp wits and excellent analytical skills, of course, obviously, but also because I know for a fact that Eulytix, which is a cutting-edge political tech venture, has collected a mountain of outstanding data, which is relevant to our discussion today, and which also hold key insights and new, fresh perspectives on the topic. Levente here will tell us more about it shortly. I was actually fortunate enough to join forces with Levente recently and use some of this data for a joint EPC Eulytix publication that came out last month and which challenged some of the familiar rumors that have been going around about. And again, Levente will let us hear more about it shortly. And you can obviously consult this publication if you want to do so after the event. It's available on the EPC website. But before we verify all my big claims about today's panel debate, I would like to pass the floor to Attila Kovacs, who is the founder and manager director of Eulytix, for a brief opening introduction as on the side of our event partners. So Attila, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I think there is a button over there.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much.
Okay.
I would like to say special thanks to Corina and the whole EPC team to host this event.
Thank you very much, Attila. So let us now turn to our panel for a totally interactive conversation, in which I propose that I first prompt our speakers with a set of specific questions, and then I will open up for debate, the debate for any queries or comments you might have. So I would like to maybe get us started from the campaign itself. In general, or usually, European elections are described as second-order national elections that are about domestic issues that normally enjoy a very low profile and attract very little interest. Based on what has unfolded until now, would you say that this time the campaign has been different, has been more European? What kind of issues have dominated the discussions until now? Maybe, Sophia, we can start from you, if that's okay.
Sure. On? Yeah, perfect. Well, I don't think that the campaigns have been so more transnational in that way. I think the elections remain to be 27 separate national elections, in a sense that the national parties are very much in the lead, and I don't see them making a true effort in describing what's at stake and describing the transnational dimension. So if we look, I don't know, at election material, billboards and so on, then there hardly ever is a reference to the transnational sort of the party family or the political groups. There's hardly, I've asked colleagues across Europe, and I mean, hardly anybody is campaigning with the lead candidates, not even the countries where the candidates are from. So far, I haven't even spotted von der Leyen in Germany, which I find very interesting. So I think, from a campaign perspective, it's very much national still, I would argue. What has changed, of course, are the topics, which have been, or let's say the crisis we're facing, they become increasingly cross-national. And therefore, I would say that EU politics has become more politicized on national level. And the stakes have been, risen slightly, and people tend to, and I mean, we see this now also in Eurobarometer data, that probably we will see even a higher, I mean, we saw a high turnout of just about 50% last time, right? And we were very happy because it was plus 8%. And we might even see a little bit more this time. But I don't think, and that's my point, I don't think this is because the national parties are doing a great job in transnational campaigning. No, this is because crises are more cross-border and people understood the role and the importance of the EU.
And what are some of those transnational crises that parties and candidates are picking up?
Climate crisis, of course, and the war. I mean, in this term, a lot of things happen that citizens are now in a very different, the EU and its citizens are in a very different situation compared to 2019. And particularly important are, of course, the geopolitical tensions and the feeling of, that Europe has to unite to be equipped with what it takes. And I think that is something that also arrives citizens.
But do you feel that the discussions about these topics, so first of all, if I understand correctly, although these topics are being politicized, they're not necessarily acknowledged or recognized by the public as being necessarily EU-wide or European. They're still discussed from a national perspective or not. And second, to the extent that they are being present in the discussions, how much are they creating any controversy, or to what extent is it all about the fact that, well, we have this crisis and they're big and important and we need to deal with them?
Yeah. No, that's a good point, especially if we look at the climate crisis, right? 2019, I think everybody agreed, okay, more Europe, we can only do this together. But by now we see that especially those parties more to the far right end of the spectrum, they're conveying, I mean, not only actually right parties more general, but the far right more, they're conveying a different kind of message. And they're conveying a kind of message of, this has gone too far, and we have to kind of tame Brussels so that they don't go, even more crazy on this. And I agree, competitiveness is very, very important, but I think that, you know, especially the green topic has been, you know, has split the camps into different, you know, we see this on billboards, by the way, in slightly Eurosceptic countries like the Czech Republic, for instance. I've heard that they're the green, you know, it says something like "Stop the Green Madness" or something like this. So, you know, so they really capitalize on, you know, Brussels has gone too far on that.
Okay, András, do you feel that? How do you feel about the campaign, first of all, and then do you feel that anything maybe important is missing in the topics that are being brought forward to the citizens by parties and candidates?
So I very much agree with you that there's no true European campaign. I don't think there's any party or any political group has any true European campaign. There are 27 national campaigns, but the positive sign, let me take a step back. So I think about 15 years ago, it was when the European Parliament was also running a similar campaign as they do now, the Get Out the Vote campaign, right? And there was this image that stuck with me, and I wrote about it back then at the time, which was a packaged chicken fillet saying too much labeling or too little labeling, as if that was a major topic for European elections. And to me, the background message is, well, Europe was dealing already with interesting stuff, but not that macro level interesting stuff. And here we are in 2024, where the European Parliament, to its credit, is far better at communicating the Get Out the Vote campaign, but also on national European level, these topics, we are dealing with global issues. And I think in every member state, this is understood. And this is reflected in the national campaigns, that it's geopolitics, it's climate issues, all the way down to farmer issues, transatlantic relations, digital, all of this. And to different degrees and with different emphasis, they all appear on national level. So we do have very important European topics that are being discussed on national level. So it's on the agenda. That I find a very positive thing, that Europe, to some degree, is sexy again, which doesn't necessarily mean it's good in the eyes of most, but it means that it's interesting enough to discuss. And I think because of that, the interest in the European elections has grown, which is a positive thing. It might be some protest vote, it might be some results that many people are very unhappy with, but it does motivate much more people to participate. At least that's what the data seem to show.
Now, indeed, and if you look at the polls, the voting intention is a bit over 70%. But do you think that this is actually going to materialize come election days? Will we see a higher turnout, and does it matter?
I think it certainly matters, because institutions, well, not just the European Parliament, but by and large European institutions take a lot of their legitimacy from voter turnout, with all the other caveats of how the different institutions are appointed, elected, and named. In terms of materializing, well, in Belgium and in a couple other countries where voting is mandatory. Actually, I'm not even sure whether it's mandatory for European Parliament elections. Yeah, it is, even for that. Okay. So as a dual citizen, I should know that. But anyways, exactly. I was going to say that it didn't concern me because I was going to vote anyways. But again, so regardless of those countries where it's mandatory, certainly you have those factors of what weather there is, and is there an interesting, I don't know, pop singer in town. But generally, I think yes. I tend to think yes. And even countries where, I think you mentioned Czech Republic, and there are a couple of countries where voter turnout has historically been abysmally low. So we'll see. That's going to be a good benchmark to say, compared to 5 years, 10 years ago, how much have those numbers improved?
Yes, but the reason I'm asking, well, it's maybe twofold. First, because we've seen that the the voting age has been lowered to 16. So there's a big percentage of new young voters voting for the first time voters, which would need to be captured and engaged to participate. And also what we're seeing is that the trend is in the direction of quite massive dissatisfaction generally. On the one hand, with democracy, with the functioning of especially national governments and this growing distrust in politicians, but also people feeling that they're not necessarily represented by their political leaders, and even with democracy in general, that people feel that democracy doesn't really work for them anymore. So in that sense, with more voters, and also on the other hand, sorry, I forgot to mention, recent research is also showing that people are actually unhappy with how political leaders have had, including the EU, at the EU level, have handled recent crisis. Anything from Brexit to the economic crisis to COVID to the war. So if there is so much dissatisfaction and criticism regarding the elites, would more people voting actually produce the desired democratic liberal results that we some of us are hoping for? It's a question. Yeah, Sophia.
First of all, the far right has been very good in mobilizing non-voters, right? So getting those to vote that didn't vote before is not always going in the direction that we wanted to go, right? And also including young people. I mean, it's true in Belgium and Germany, 16 to 18-year-olds can vote for the first time now. How will they vote? It's very interesting because up until very recently, we would have all been super sure the younger the more left, right? So if you open up to younger voter groups, then you open up to the left. But then we recently seen, like TikTok stars like Jordan Bardella. Right. I mean, this is really like very critical what's happening there. There has been a study by the German newspaper Die Zeit, which shows that in Germany, people between 14 and 29, their support in all political parties is dropping, and it went steeply up from 10 to 20% for the AfD. Wow. I mean, this is something that was very shocking and very surprising to me. So these people, and that is linking up to your point on the representation, Corina, which I find is a very important one, because indeed, I think that is one of the biggest issues, generally speaking, with democracy nowadays, that we have an issue with representation. People don't feel represented by the political elites, and especially young people don't feel represented by them. But they then suddenly feel represented by, Bardella and others that are, young and handsome, and that are very active on unusual platforms, and that they succeed in appearing attractive by, I find, almost concealing their actual mindsets, right? I mean, if you look at their social media account, it doesn't also sound so radical, huh? There's a lot of everyday life stuff, there's a lot of kind of, look, I'm one of you, and I'm representing you. And, this is what then, lets these numbers increase. And so, yeah, on the turnout, you're right. By the way, I mean, there's a huge range. I think in Slovenia or Slovakia, but I think it was Slovenia or Slovakia. We were, I think, below 20% even, right? I mean, so that is not, yeah.
Just two ideas there. I think one is that there seems to be, and in most countries, and also in transatlantic politics, meaning US and broadly speaking European politics, there seems to be an increasing distinction between those who question the system and those who are unhappy with the decisions of the system, right? And I think everyone in this room wants a system. We believe in institutions. We believe in certain rules, certain processes, certain systems around it. And you might be very dissatisfied with what decisions those particular institutions take. But that's why you have elections, and that's why you have processes, and that's why you have scrutiny and cross-checking to change those. But the system as such should not be called into question. But then you have a lot of forces on both ends of the political spectrum who challenge the very existence of certain institutions. So I think that's a massive pressure on overall what we call democracy. And that has to be challenged and fought with every democratic and legitimate means to say the institutions must stay in place. Continuously, you need to improve them. You need to make them more transparent. You need to make them more accountable. You need to make sure that they adhere to their very own principles, which often is not the case, that they are not hollowed out from the inside. But then again, that's what democracy is about, that you can challenge the decisions you make based on those. And the second point is just, to some degree, we're seeing European politics becoming Eurovision. So it's really in its not necessarily in a good sense, well, entertaining to some degree, but the alliances, the adherence, the identity politics, all of those dynamics that we see, what used to be a fun show, now it's much more political, but also in European politics, of who allies with whom, what sort of and you know, performance is kind of secondary, because other factors play into who votes for whom. So again, you could draw a lot of parallel. I'm not saying EPC should write a study on that, but certainly the dynamics are somewhat similar to me.
Yeah, I mean, I saw, Sophia, that you want to come back in, but I wanted to add one thing, because you talked about the appeal of the radicals, and of course it's clearly, some of it goes down to their messaging and to their skills in communication skills. But I'm wondering also whether it's increasingly due also to some adaptation techniques, to the extent that some of them at least are seeking to approach the mainstream in different sense, just as much as the mainstream is actually going towards them. And so there's a radicalization to a certain extent of the mainstream in an attempt to recapture the voters from the radicals, as well as the radicals trying to look or to sound more centrist to a certain extent. I mean, we've seen even yesterday with the refusal right of what is it called, yes, exactly, to join forces with AFD in ID. So how perhaps it's also this at play that we're coming up against in trying to ensure that the voters vote the liberal democratic way.
I mean, what we see at the far right is both, right? We see those that are moderating and those that are more radicalizing, and everything in between. I mean, it's very messy there. And all the talks that we have about the far right are very interesting, but they're all very speculative now. And we don't know what they're going to do. After every elections, the two groups now that used to be three, by the way, up until 2019, right? And then you have the non-attached. I mean, there's always renaming, there's reshuffling, there's regrouping. And now AfD has been kicked out of ID, which I saw coming. AfD has become totally unbearable for Le Pen ahead of the presidential elections. So this was a necessary move for her. The now peace is also becoming unbearable for Meloni in the ECR group, right? So this will be, then Orban really wants to get into one of these groups again after he had to leave the EPP 2 years ago, right? So since then he's in the non-attached, he doesn't like it, he wants to be in the group, he wants to be in the ECR, they probably don't let him. Now that the AfD is out, I think the ID is more attractive for him again, right? So we see a lot of reshuffling on the right spectrum, but I'm saying that not everybody there wants to moderate, right? You have Meloni, and you have a couple of parties that you can name where you would say, okay, they at least on EU level.
Exactly, they're being strategic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what they do then in Italy and elsewhere is a different thing.
No, and indeed we have seen it also in the work that we've tried to do, Levente, that these kind of groups are quite incohesive, right, and quite unpredictable in how they behave, but also with each other, but also with the more traditional right, center right, right?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. That's wonderful. Yes, but at first I'd like to add some points to the ensuing discussion. I think in gauging what effect a potentially higher turnout might have on the center parties in the European Parliament, we should not disregard the idiosyncratic, that is to say, country-specific dynamics that are at play here. For example, in France, the recent events that hijacked Macron's campaign into a more security direction might play into the far right's direction, but on the other hand, the recent upheaval of local politics in Hungary might as well weaken Mr. Orban's punch. So in that specific country, we might as well see an opposite effect than in France. So this is what I wanted to highlight. But then, of course, the far right in the European Parliament is very fragmented. For example, if we look at the voting cohesion of the far-right parties, that is the Identity of Democracy group and ECR group during plenary roll call votes, we see that they are the least cohesive groups in the whole European Parliament. Also, they are quite unsuccessful. During plenary voting sessions, they are in less than 50% on the winning side. That is to say, in exact statistics, the ID was on the winning side in 44% of the cases, while the ECR in 55%. That is startlingly low when contrasted to the amazingly high stat of the Greens with 87%, and the still remarkably high statistic of the Renew Euro group of 86%. Also, what I'd like to add here is that this the weak cohesion of the radical parties is not evenly distributed across issue areas. We have some issue areas where the cooperation of these parties is stronger, in some weaker. Foreign policy comes to mind. Think Ukraine, for example. There is an apparent rift between some components of ID and ECR. ECR, especially the Polish Law and Justice Party, seems to be very pro-Atlantic, pro-European, pro-Ukraine, and that's less so, but in direction in that case, while some parties in ID are less so. This is a breaking point within the radical right-wing groups in the parliament. While on the other hand, in the case, for example, environment policy, far-right parties might find common ground and align themselves with each other, and quite appallingly, in some cases, even the EPP sided with them. This is not a very pronounced phenomenon, but that did happen sometimes. We might as well speak about this a bit later on.
So how do you feel that this then squares with all the forecasts that we've heard in the lead up to this vote, of where you, on the one hand, you have polls predicting a significant increase in the vote for far right parties. And on the other hand, also having newspapers and commentators and analysts coming up with very scary headlines. I quote, "The nationalist time bomb is ticking," and I quote again, "This time the threat is real." How concerned should we be, given what you're telling us about the behavior and the patterns of interaction of these parties in the parliament?
Well, first of all, I'd like to point out the fact that this is an ongoing tendency that centrist parties lose ground in the European Parliament. The effect so far has been gradual, and I think it will be no different this time. That is to say, I fail to see a critical juncture why we would see a landslide movement this time around. Or at this point, I'd like to allude to a recent study with Corina, where we ran a simulation exercise where we asked the question how different things would have been in this current legislative cycle had this distribution of seats been as projected. Now, our analysis shows that merely 5% of the voting sessions would have had a different outcome. This is remarkably low. That is to say, in absolute numbers, about 800 voting sessions would have had a different outcome out of the more than 17,000. Well, at first, this is very low, but breaking down these affected voting sessions by issue area, some valuable insight is obtained. The most affected issue areas are environment policy, agriculture, institutions, social policy, and CFSP. These are crucial issue areas. These are issue areas where the European People Party might feel tempted to cooperate with the far-right groups of ID and ECR. So far, I do not think this will be the case, but in my opinion, the critical question here is how far right the EPP is willing to go. I think things will remain as they were in this cycle. We will not see a remarkable shift to the right in the EPP's case, but only time will tell. I have several reasons to believe this, other than the numbers that we have calculated with Corina in that article. First of all, the primary partners of the EPP so far either gauged in co-voting patterns or in co-sponsorship of amendments. By co-sponsorship of amendments in the parliamentary committees, I mean the social exercise that MEPs quite often table jointly together amendments in the European Parliament's committees. Basically, they are motivated to do that to increase the chances of success, but this could be seen as a social exercise. So what I mean is, so far, the European People's Party's primary cooperators have been the Renew Eurogroup and the Socialists. And I think it will remain this way. In the case of co-sponsorship, there are some sociological factors at play. For example, we have weak empirical evidence that cross-party co-sponsoring relationships are quite persistent. For example, if we have two MEPs from different groups and they have co-sponsored a few amendments in the previous cycle, given that they are re-elected in the next one, they are 5 times as likely to co-sponsor amendments together than who have not done this in the previous. And as we know, about 40 to 50% of MEPs are re-elected based on the previous 2 cycles. This could have an effect on the EPP's behavior, especially in the committees where party discipline is not that much of a heavy requirement as it is in plenary sessions. So I think the EPP, on a rational choice basis, might be reluctant to give up this social infrastructure it has built over the years with the centrist parties. This is something that might discourage them to open up to the far right and thus raise their existing social infrastructure. But I will tell how it will all turn out.
Right. So all these predictions have to be put into perspective, and certainly EPP comes out as having huge responsibility on its shoulder in the next parliament. How do you feel about it? Do you think the polls are correct, and do you expect that if they prove to be correct, and we will see a tide of radical Eurosceptic nationalistic forces in the new parliament, that this will have huge implications for policy and otherwise? Sophia, do you?
Yeah, I think when we look at this, the rise of the far right, then we are in a situation like the proverbial frog in the hot water, because every time before the elections we have exactly these discussions, right? Yes. I mean, the times that I'm observing the EP elections, I can say that I have the feeling some discussions are almost, copy paste, And then what happens is that during the term we realize, oh, ça va, it works, yeah. And then at the end of the term, we think like, okay, everything actually, this wasn't so bad. The situation is not as dire as we thought. And then, the new, polling comes out and it increases, and everybody's like again crying. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, but my point is that doesn't make it less bad. I just think we get kind of the water is slowly getting hot. There is a steady increase. I mean, if you look at the numbers of seat allocation to far right parties, I mean, there have been, I think Le Pen's party has been there since the 80s, but for a long time, there has been very, very little representation. But in the last 20 years, there is a steady increase of seats that go to far right parties. And that will, of course, have an effect on also the way that the narratives in the debates are shifted, are shaped within the parliament, right? I agree. I think EPP will find, while they might have these constraints that you outlined, they might be inclined to look to the right on some issues where they know that the Social Democrats, for instance, or the Greens will be or the Liberals will be a more difficult partner, right? So I think the agenda will certainly be will get more conservative in that sense. It's not a far right surge, but it is a steady increase, and it is something for all of us to kind of keep in mind that where is the distinction between the right and the far right? What is acceptable from a societal standpoint, and where do we have to draw the line? Where do the democratic parties draw the line? I mean, we have this cordon sanitaire against the ID group in the parliament. And I mean, that is very that holds strong for the moment, right? As you mentioned, amendments. So if ID tables amendments, none of the other parties votes on them, right? Or they are, although if you calculate by, they should actually have, for instance, committee chairs and maybe even a vice president's post, and they don't get it, right? So you have this kind of strategic exclusions of the democratic parties, but it's not against the ECR, and in the ECR you also have a Vox, for instance, and I'm like, okay, but yeah. So I think this distinction. So where do you apply the cordon sanitaire and where not? There's a lot of political reasoning also behind, and there's a lot of what is comfortable for the political party that we're talking about, right?
András, did you want to come in and then come back to you?
If I may, a couple ideas there. I think just on the very point on right, far right, even the definition of far right, I think it depends on where you stand. Mm-hmm. What's your point of reference on the political spectrum? Because you might say this is really not far right, because from where I am, this is not far. Or from where I am, this is very, very far. And even if I'm shifting direction. Anyways, I think there's a lot of anchoring effect there, where this kind of political shift pulls the others towards a different direction, even if there is no direct coalitions or direct co-sponsoring or similar. Another, maybe just a broader point that I'd like to make, which is, again, thinking back, I think it was about, 10, 15, anyways, many years ago, when Juncker was about to be the European Commission president. There was a similar event at another, it was a media company, and they asked the audience to put their hands up who thought that Juncker would actually become the European Commission president. And about 90% of the hands, went up to say that he will not be, right? Like those in the room thought that this would not happen because the way the stars were aligned at that moment, nobody thought that he could pull it off. And yet, and the point I want to make with this little anecdote is that we have a lot of intuitions, and those in diplomatic circles and in professional analytic, other kind of the Brussels bubble, we tend to think we know. But then come companies like Eulytix and similar other analytics and data-driven organizations who look at the historical data. They look at patterns. They look at all of this, and this increasingly has predictive value. So not just what happened in the past, but to say what is likely to happen in the not so distant future. And those often contradict our intuitions. So my idea is or my message there is to be very careful with what we think we know, and try to be much more data driven in that, which is not to discount the insights and the plus looks conversations and the cocktail parties and the rumors. Factor that in by all means, but there's a lot better job that we can do if we use the data correctly and in the right way. And again, this is not to do the commercial plug here. It's more the systems that are increasingly available to everyone in political science, in consultancy, in research, to base those opinions on that. And that's fascinating to me, what Levente just said, that you did a counterfactual. You said, have happened if the results had been, well, on the face of it, not much different. But then you dig a little deeper and say, well, there were actually a couple of votes. And just think of, say, one vote, Ukraine's membership, or maybe being a candidate country. And you say, well, it was maybe one of the 17,000 decisions, but we could say it's quite consequential. So not just to look at the quantities there, but to say, okay, which issues would this matter, and use data and more analytics to base your decisions upon.
Also, because otherwise it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy if you really just believe everything you hear. But Levente, I'll come in if you want, and then I'll, because I had.
Okay, but I wanted to react to Sophia first. So far, I wholeheartedly agree with you that we should not treat the ECR and ID groups as the same. We should make a distinction between soft and hard Euroscepticism. I'd argue that in most cases, the ECR can be labeled soft or sometimes hard Eurosceptics, but the ID is almost every time a hard Eurosceptic party. But in the European Parliament so far, the left, that is to say the Nordic Green Alliance, has usually been labeled soft Eurosceptic. But we see evidence that their concerns have been partially addressed during the committee phases of this legislative cycle. By this, I mean we have empirical evidence that the MEPs of this group have been remarkably efficient at passing amendments at the committee level. And I can totally see that ECR will be somewhat similar to them in the next cycle, given the fact that the EPP might lend a helping hand to them in this case, but they would need other supporters, and we will see how things will turn out in that regard. But also to add to the points that András said, I like to compare our data-driven work here to the relationship between history and archaeology. Historians usually work from written sources, and the written sources should be questions. I mean, their contents should be questions. On the other hand, archaeologists dig up relics of the past from the ground, and their findings help either reinforce or falsify the results of historians. Think about the ancient kings of either Assyria or something like that. For example, the Assyrians have never lost a battle in history according to their annals, but for a matter of fact, we knew that they have lost a lot of battles, in fact.
So both are important, both yes, history and archaeology.
Yes, they are complementary to each other. In
yes.
My view.
Yeah. I wanted maybe to dig a little bit deeper into these vulnerable areas that come out as from the simulation that we did. So we find that climate is particularly at risk, but also issues like agriculture, EU institutions, common foreign security policy, and was it social policy, if I remember correctly? Social policy, yes. So do you, in your opinion, are those areas where we would see a complete sort of backsliding or going back on progress that has been made, or how in the worst case scenario, how could we think that this can be affected? For example, if we think of climate, how much the discussion about the Green Deal has changed, you know, from last time it was a determining issue for the outcome of the elections. And we've seen massive support for the topic in the past elections. And now it has become more politicized, it has become more controversial, it does raise more debate, given the likelihood of different alliances in the next parliament. Could we see the Green Deal work that has been done being rolled back? Are you afraid of that? Are you concerned about that?
I'm somewhat concerned. I do not think we will see a significant backsliding, but I think the progress even further might be hindered by the new realities of the next parliament, but I do not think it will be that significant. For example, reading through the party manifestos, we see that most of the centrist parties seem to be intent on continuing the direction so far set down. Even the EPP even reiterates the necessity for the nature restoration law, which was the only ordinary legislative procedure that would have entirely failed, given the projected realities according to our simulations. So that is pretty reassuring in my opinion, but there might be cases where progress will be significantly slower. And I'm pretty much afraid of that, but I certainly hope for the best in this regard.
What about, for example, EU institutions? I mean, we're at the point where we're discussing the possibility of updating EU's functioning and architecture and streamlining decision-making for various reasons, but especially to make the EU, put the EU in a better position to withstand current and future challenges. Do we risk that any progress in that regard will also be affected? How do you feel about those areas that are at risk?
Well, it's true, of course, that those parties that are right from the EPP are those that are traditionally skeptical about enlargement and also about EU reform, right? Or the kind of EU reform that we're talking about. They have a different kind of EU reform in mind, right? But I mean, I think a more general point, I think what we will see, so it's all on all these topics, it is very difficult to say eventually. Why? Because the next parliament will become more unpredictable. I think that is an important point, because we will see that there are basically all the coalitions that is ad hoc decision making in decisions on specific files that are politically doable. They all hover around 50%, give or take, right? So this means there are a lot of different, as were last time, there are different coalitions possible, but because the margins get slimmer for the centrist and the three that were responsible for most of the decisions in the last term, all these predictions in terms of policy effects, I think, are very, very difficult to make.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe going back for a second to the institutional question, which I think is, it must be done. The way decision making works, especially in the most sensitive areas, with the idea of enlarging the EU further, is just unworkable. You look at the EU 27 right now, and whether or not you agree with certain vetoes and certain positions, if you think of an EU of 35 countries, which again, whether politically feasible or not is a separate question, but if you just play with that hypothetical, it's completely unworkable in the current setup, that with the vetoes and others. Or it could be put on the table to say, okay, that was I think it was a Juncker line to say, to do, maybe do less, but do better, something along those lines. So that could be a political strategy as well. And to say, okay, the EU is not going to find new areas of competence and new areas to legislate on. We stick to the good old core competencies that currently have, and enlarge in that way. But even in that setup, some institutional reform needs to be done, and especially decision-making reform.
Yes, but in the current campaign, have parties and candidates spoken about these issues? Have they touched, for example, you mentioned enlargement. You just mentioned enlargement, and it's linked to reform. Has it been discussed at all by anybody? And how do you go from the campaign and from the manifestos to actually taking the hard decisions that lie ahead? And does that increase potentially the risk that we will see little progress, or a stalemate, or actually a reversal of progress that has been done? Did you want to come in, Levente? I see you with the microphone, but I don't know.
Yes, I'd like to come in. When it comes to institutional reforms or enlargement, what struck my eye while reading through the manifestos is the reference for in most of the party manifestos, especially the centrist one, to the principle of subsidiarity. This is, I think, this is a crucial concept here, which probably may as well point towards a bit more tamer approach than in this cycle, but we will have to see this. Also, when it comes to the low margin for error that Sophia has talked about, when it comes to key policy decisions, I think this effect will be somewhat mitigated by the fact that the Commission, as well as the Parliament, the committees, will have to adjust to the new political realities of the next European Parliament. Therefore, the content of these policies might be shaped accordingly, so that the broader consensus can be reached. I think in case of institutional reform, I agree with András that it is pretty much a must. It will have to be done, but its content, it is what remains to be seen. Here, I think, I certainly hope so, a compromise will have to be reached. And I think the EU cannot afford failure in this regard. So I pretty much believe the contents of these reforms will be adjusted so that it will pass.
And is this an issue on which the radicals tend to be united on, and on which actually they would agree with what you're saying, because more and more we're hearing declarations from these kind of parties about the need to reform the EU, the need to, it's not about quitting the EU anymore, but it's about doing something about it and changing it, right?
Yeah, right. By reforming the EU, they most certainly mean that pulling it back from the supranational path and steering it towards a more intergovernmental direction. But also, they are not. The far right is not that much unified, to my knowledge, on the issue of enlargement. For example, Mr. Orban's party is pretty much in favor of enlargement, while the National Rally is less so in France.
Indeed. So you mentioned something interesting, which is the potential impact of more radicals in the next parliament on the other institutions. Would you agree that there would be some sort of spillover effect on the other actors in the system, but also on the national level?
I mean, but these are determined by national elections then, right? I mean, who sits on the council, the European Council is determined by national elections, and who sits in the commission by extension too, because we know that usually the government in that moment, I mean, it's the same party that the commissioner has of the government in that moment of appointment, right? So here, I don't know in how far there's a spillover between these elections, but for sure, when we talk about the far right, then we have to turn to what is happening on national level and how this translates into the other institutions, and how then those, you know, players, how they act there. I mean, I think Meloni is a good, you know, example of having, again, moderated on European level, but, you know, has not necessarily done so on national level, but, you know, European leaders are happy with her as long as she's, you know, nice and cooperative on EU level, right? And then they turn a bit of blind eye on other things. Also important, I think, in these institutions, there cannot be this cordon sanitaire that we have from the parliament, right? So the strategic exclusion of those parties from taking part in decision making. Why? Because in the council, and especially in the European Council, the modus operandi is negotiation. Of course, there's voting sometimes, but, you know, the voting only takes place when they already know that things go through, right? So they sit around the table, and so it is impossible to exclude. So, you know, the more representatives of far right parties in council and European Council, you know, I think there is even more danger maybe than a rise and increase in seats in the European Parliament.
Because I'm conscious of the time, I want to maybe pause here for a second and see whether there's any questions or comments from your side for our speakers. Yeah. Okay, there are two. Brave hands, yes. And briefly introduce yourself.
Michael Freitag, World of Europe, Voice of Employment Industries Partner for Temporary Agency Work. A question about social Europe, about the social affairs dimension in these EU elections, because of course we know in the last elections it played an important role due to COVID, due to the crisis. Now it seems in many countries employment is on the rise. We will talk about labor shortages. We saw the Commission Action Plan. So we seem to be in a better place, but still youth unemployment is high in many countries. So what is your take on the role of social Europe in the elections to come in the next mandate of the Commission?
Yeah, many thanks for the very useful and very interesting presentations. Now, just two quick questions concerning the next steps, especially in July with the election of the possibly of the new president. I mean, even if it's not clear whether the vote will be in September or July, but let's assume it will be in July. What would be, according to you, maybe the behavior of the S&D group? Would you think that, you know, the support to the possibly next candidate from the EPP side will be supported to some extent by the SN group? And what would be also your views concerning Renew, especially since the coalition, the new coalition in the Netherlands and the, well, thanks.
Right.
Thank you. My name is Eileen. I work for TBI, the Tony Blair Institute, just upstairs. I wanted to ask the panel to know about the implications of this new institutional cycle, this new parliament, to EU relations with the world, with third countries. What does a more right-wing parliament and the repercussions in the composition of the Commission as well would mean for EU's role in the world, and how can third countries look into this, and what can they expect from the EU?
We'll take these questions for a first round, and then if there's more, we come back to them. András, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'll address all questions, but
no, you can.
I'll cherry pick.
Please do.
The ones that resonate with me. Yeah, with like this social Europe question, I think again it comes down to the foundations of politics. Of is it about competitiveness and then distributing its benefits of a competitive European economy, or saying a more kind of protective kind of Europe is the approach. And given that the shift more to the right is almost a given, the chances are that the approach will be, well, make Europe more competitive, and that can yield benefits for those who are disadvantaged or not have the means. But again, how this will play out, and given the limited competencies the EU has on most social questions, at least directly speaking, it can shape things, but it will largely depend on how member states approach that. The other point, Europe and the world, I think it's that's where the biggest rifts are going to be, and we're already seeing it, in my view. If you look at just you take, I say 3 words, or maybe 4. I say Russia, Ukraine, Middle East, or more specifically Israel, Gaza, and Argentina. Right? You take these countries and you really have a hodgepodge of positions or relations of each member state and political group, of what connotations come up simply by saying these particular entities, countries, territories. So I think it's going to be pretty fragmented, and a lot will depend on what is going to be, well, who will be the high representative, commission, the VP, who will be the commission president, and even President Metsola. She was very active on a lot of foreign policy matters, but the parliament is more of a symbolic actor there. So again, what the EU's, and then with European Council, now you see with Ireland and Spain and Norway recognizing Palestine as a country. So again, there is a rift. So it's really messy already, and probably will be even more so when it comes to foreign policy. And certainly we see how that kind of trickles down to trade issues. You look at bilateral or with Mercosur, or again with Israel specifically, or with other more faraway countries. So I'm curious how that's going to play out, but it's going to be very fragmented, in my view.
Mm-hmm. Which doesn't really bode well, given the context. Sophia?
Yeah. I'm not an expert on social policy and also not on foreign policy, so I'm not going to touch upon these questions, other than saying, from an institutional perspective, indeed, the parliament is not a decisive actor for foreign policy. So how the parliament is composed doesn't have as great implications on foreign policy as how the European Council is. Mainly the European Council is doing the foreign policy. Also, much more. The role of a high rep depends very much on who is going to get that job and whether this person is able to build up a bit more credibility than the current and also the past one, I would argue. But the question of what happens after the vote, yes, I think that's very interesting. Von der Leyen or whoever will be, appointed by the European Council, because she's far from a shoo-in, right? Also she realizes this because she's campaigning now a little bit, will have it very difficult, because it's a secret vote. That voting discipline is, anyhow, a bit less than we know from national parliaments. If it's a secret vote, MEPs, of course, they don't feel bound by their party recommendations whatsoever. And last time we remember it was super tight with what 8 or 9 votes too many, right? So what she will have to do is to go and shop around the political groups and make policy promises in exchange for the vote. And then, that might work or might not work. But I think, speaking about whether July or September, first of all, I think the parliament, from a parliament's perspective and political groups' perspective, they have more of an interest to push it in September because they like to have more time. But also maybe she needs more time, because she will have to have a lot of time to discuss the details of the agenda that she has in mind for the next term. And again, negotiate with them. This will be, horse trading. So I think, yes, and very interesting here will be the Greens, whether they want to be part of the von der Leyen Commission next time or not, and whether they get their act together, because I learned the other day that they have not voted on the Commission president for the last 4 times. And in von der Leyen, they only decided to not vote for her the night before. So they have been very unreliable partners for the other 3 that went together a lot. Schmidt, the only thing I have to say there is I think he will now, his strategy is to convince the S&D that they want to have one more representative in the college from the S&D for free, so to speak, so that they make it a condition for the vote on von der Leyen that he stays in the college. You see, that is like kind of the strategy that I'm seeing here, because he is campaigning like massive, right? And everybody's wondering, why is he doing it? Because he's not going to be commission president, right? But he's doing it because this is his only ticket in the commission, to pressure his own party to say, guys, look at, otherwise it's currently, I think we have 4 leaders in the European Council from the S&D, and that will be 1 for free. So the message will be, you guys help me with pressuring her, with a vote in the parliament, and then she will pressure Luxembourg to say, don't send the Christian Democrat that is already picked. So yeah, let's see. Renew, very briefly, interesting. Yes, the VVD is out, right? The Dutch, the French, the French Renew don't want them there because they're now in the coalition with the far right. Renew, anyhow, is very, very. It's a bit of a messy group, right? Because it's three components, of which 2 are European parties, 1 is a national party, and they have to be 2 in the. There were 2 groups in the term before. Then Macron came with his Renaissance list, and what we saw internally in this group is that Macron was kind of a kingmaker within Renew. So how the group was deciding was a lot swayed by what Macron was doing. But I have the feeling that this is not one big happy family there, and I think we will also see a bit of reshifting on that side.
Which is weakening the center a little bit, huh?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But because the Spitzenkandidaten process came up, and this time we saw that most parties have put forward candidates. Some of them have put more than 1 or 2 candidates forward. Do you think that then the likelihood of having the next Commission president come from among those candidates, lead candidates, is higher than last time, or could we see it undermined? Does it lend more credibility to the process, the fact that it went down the way it went down this time, in your opinion?
I think credibility is taken away from the procedure this time by the political parties not really playing the game, I think. What they did is they appointed candidates, but yeah, a bit of a, B selection. And then also these candidates, they don't really campaign. Except for Schmidt, but von der Leyen, what does she do? She doesn't campaign, she visits EPP governments, right? She doesn't go out there and does, an election campaign. The Liberal candidates, they even said, we don't want to have a job in the commission. What kind of lead candidate is this then, right? So it's like the whole term of lead candidate gets completely, everybody understands it in a different way, So you have these parties, they keep the process alive by appointing candidates, but I'm wondering sometimes why they're doing it and they're not doing it properly, either to play the game and then play it really, but, don't appoint candidates which don't have a serious chance, because that is the whole point. If you want the European Council to pick your candidate, you need to pick a candidate which is acceptable to the European Council.
Yeah, but this has been put forward initially as a hope for the transnationalization of the elections, the Europeanization, transnationalization of European election, and also for obviously giving more legitimacy to the Commission and politicizing the Commission. So if it fails this time again, Is it the end of it? Do we put a cross on it, in your opinion?
The problem is that it had been sold for something what it's not. It had been sold for something that, as an automatic process, it is made for parliamentary democracy. The EU is not. We have it's partly, but we also have member states, and they sit around that table, and member states have the right to appoint this candidate, and the parliament can just not simply overrule this, right? It's too strength as legitimacy, and I think that is something what the mistake of the parliament. I understood why they did it as they did it, but they told the voters, that this procedure is fulfilling something which it cannot. I'm not saying scrap it. I think it brings transparency, and it opens a little bit the black box, but it cannot be, a full-fledged procedure. It can only be always, let's say, the way Parliament chooses its candidate, and then it's still up for the European Council whether or not they pick this candidate. And again, that depends on how good the candidates are, and where is it going to be dead or not? I think a lot depends on whether von der Leyen will become Commission President or not. Because if she won't, although she, as a high profile, ran as a lead candidate, then I would put a big question mark on that. Yeah,
would be the nail in the coffin. Yeah, but do you see a scenario in which the candidate, the next Commission President will come not from among the
absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. This is a 50-50. I mean, 50-50 is maybe a bit dramatic. I mean, if you would have asked me 4 weeks ago, I would have said von der Leyen is a shoe-in. I'm not sure anymore.
Yeah.
And if it's not her, it will be another EPP candidate and not one of the lead candidates. So then. Yeah. I don't know.
Have you watched the debates that have taken place with the lead candidates? Yeah. And how did you feel about their performance?
Von der Leyen is von der Leyen. She's very professional. She's slick. She's a very professional politician, right? There's no mistakes happening on her end. It's a bit boring. The only thing that was slightly interesting in the debates was indeed what went viral then when she said she's going to cooperate with ECR, but not with ID, which I don't find surprising, actually. And she was in no position to say otherwise because it's happening already. I mean, they do these agreements already, coordination. And then Schmidt in both debates has been very invisible and not, spicy enough, I find. I do think it was good that the ID was represented in the Maastricht debate, and I think it's a pity that ECR was not, and it's also a pity that they're not going to be represented today, because it is a bit of a weird. I mean, come on, we're talking about the rise of the far right, and then we have a lead candidate debate where none of them is represented. Like, what kind of debate is this? You have the center and the left debating amongst each other, and those that we're talking about all the time, they're not even around the table. So, yeah.
All right.
Maybe just one thought there, because I think this is a kind of a symptomatic of a larger issue, more of the tip of the iceberg. Where is it the kind of the Europeanization of EU politics and having trans-European parties and generally a more federal push versus a more of a confederate, or maybe find a more suitable term, but along those lines, where the kind of the nations of Europe only joining forces for the issues that they truly see value in, right? So and having the Spitzenkandidat and all those is the symptom of that, of which larger strategic priorities they organize themselves around. Mm-hmm. And it seems that's what shows this rift, where there is less appetite for the federalization, for lack of a better word, of European policies, which again is not a judgment whether it's a good or bad thing. It's just simply that seems to be the mood, and reflected also in this push or transition towards the right and all of that. So being a bit more pragmatic and say, look at what we've got, consolidate that, instead of being ever more ambitious but staying somewhat superficial in our achievement. And just as a footnote to say, look at the single market. I mean, it's been declared a victory, and yet there are so many aspects from capital markets and other aspects which are still not a reality. So again, that this is a big change of kind of more Europe, and to what degree is it achievable, versus consolidating the achievements and deepening that.
We derailed a little bit from the three questions, but if Levente, if you still want to pick up on some of them and also weigh into what has been just discussed, please feel free to do so.
On the questions, first, the second, and the third, Sophia has perfectly summarized my thoughts and some more. But on the fourth, meaning the EU relations with the rest of the world, I think a crucial dimension of this is trade relations. And with a dominant shift to the right that is not happening right now, but might happen in the future, we might drift into a direction where the Commission will not be forced to and not be willing to include too many normative requirements into trade deals, which in the past have led to the failure of signing trade deals, for example, with India. And I think with Indonesia, the trade deal is in quite a limbo right now. And I think these normative requirements pertaining to environment protection or labor rights are impediments to finalizing these trade deals. These might suffer a setback, and the EU might, in some weird sense, benefit from this. But I think more things will have to happen than the current surge of the far right in the European for this to happen. This is what I wanted to add for the.
Okay. Are there any more questions or comments? Yes, we have.
Thank you for the floor, Dmytro Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. I'm just curious how wide is understanding between voters the fact that this is not the ordinary elections. This is elections in the conditions of war. It was particularly interesting to hear that far right and far left sometimes trying to destroy the existing democratic institutions. But, you know, in democratic society, it's how to say, it's normal to make the democratic institutions more sufficient. But if that democratic efforts will weaken democracy itself, the alternative could be the bombs falling to the European cities. So do voters understand that? And the second question, if I may, the far right and both far left parties traditionally were the target for Russian influences, for Russian special services, and even corruptions in some cases, proved one. So how deep that factor had the influence to the future elections? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jarek Sealer. I'm at the mission of Canada to the European Union. I kind of, in my analysis of the elections today, there's two dichotomies I'd like you to dig at a little bit, if you don't mind. The first is you mentioned a number of transnational issues that will feature in voters' minds, but I think one that's missing is the question of cost of living and getting on the housing ladder for young people. We have more younger voters now with the 16-year-olds, and a lot of these are not competence EU level, but the voters don't necessarily know that. So I'd just be interested in how your forecasting models are anticipating the potential impact, if any, of that reality, because I think it's an important issue in a lot of particularly young people's minds. The second question relates to Renew, because I see a dichotomy there in the sense that there are anticipated losses in France in particular, as was rightly pointed out by the panelists. There's a lot of fragmentation in this group. At the same time, they're still slated to probably be the slight kingmaker to a degree to allow for a centrist coalition to emerge. And we also have the reality of President Macron no longer has a majority in the Assemblée Nationale. He's fighting tooth and nail to be able to counter the far right in France. At the same time, having a weakened group at the European Parliament level, I would argue, would make that a little bit more complicated, but just be for his ability to exert French ambitions on the EU stage. So just be interested on your thoughts on those two subjects. Thanks.
Time, or do you need more time for thinking? Yeah,
I might not answer them all, but I will try. So first, regarding whether the voters know that we are that is yes, we are at war. I think they are well aware of that, and I think this is partly the reason why the Eurobarometer statistics show higher than usual interest in taking part in this democratic exercise. For example, 60% of the respondents said they are interested in the European elections, and the remarkable 71 said that they are likely to participate in these elections. I think these are in part a result of the ongoing war and the geopolitical upheaval all around the world. About Russian influence, well, this is a tricky question. to estimate the effect of Russian influence in the election campaign. My guess is that we see that some parties, in cases entire governments sort of embrace Russian propaganda regarding the war of Russia in Ukraine. So in some cases, I think the effect might be quite pronounced and less so in some others. So I think it's very difficult to draw a general picture about the effects of Russian influence in the elections. I think the effect is there, but it might not be as prominent as we usually think it is. But unfortunately, I have no data nor any empirical evidence to back up my claim. These are my gut feelings and anecdotic evidence. About the cost of living, I didn't quite catch the whole meaning of this, how aware the voters are about this issue.
How it impacts young voters.
How it impacts young voters. First, I'd like to add that we at Eulytix do not model voters' behavior. We restrict our analysis to European institutions. We have no models to explain how aware voters are about this issue. But all I can do is look at party manifestos. Parties are aware, except Greece, I think, and the European Free Alliance, for example, and speak from personal experience, which I don't think is pretty much a valuable insight here. But I think most of the young people are pretty much aware of this issue. But it might not be the key factor in determining their voters' choice. About Renew. Now, I think Renew will lose quite a bit of influence. Renew was sort of a kingmaker in cases because their relatively big size could make or break a deal. This will, to some extent, continue in the next session, I think. But with diminished numbers and the already present fragmentation, Renew might not be able to influence the process to the extent that it has been able to do so in the current cycle.
Just
again, I'm probably not going to take all questions. Maybe I'll take the first. So I'll start with, say, you take Renew. I think again, I hope I won't be too philosophical there, but to me, the term liberalism, which is at the core of Renew's own identity, is being redefined, and I think they are the way their members relate to that reflects this, I wouldn't say identity crisis, but the very term is being again re-specified of what that actually means in today's world and specifically in Europe. So again, on social issues and on economic liberalism, and these two has always created a certain kind of rift inside Renew, but that rift might be more visible in the coming term. In terms of your question, I think in Europe at war, I mean, it's extremely serious, and there seems to be by now a certain kind of desensitization, if I say that correctly. So kind of getting used to it, a habituation, maybe that's easier to pronounce, to the war, which is human nature to some degree, but it's incredible, right? I mean, there is war in Europe. These are words that in 2019 no one would have ever dared to utter, and I think, to the credit of the much despised elites, they seem to understand it. But it's us, the people, again, not necessarily those who are very concerned by this, but generally, it doesn't seem to be so high on the agenda anymore. And not just the war itself, but the reasons that led to it. And here I turn to the Russian interference and the propaganda and subversion attempts and all that, which I think had been going on for a very long time. Perhaps you can say for several decades. And of course, it's not just Russia, but a lot of authoritarian, extremist ideology-driven countries, nations have been very active in this city and generally in European politics, also on national level, influencing European politics. And I don't think it has been given the sufficient amount of attention and effort to fight against that. And that is very, well, disappointing is an understatement. And there are efforts, and I myself have worked on certain projects done by some EU institutions, and there are initiatives against the propaganda or the foreign interference aspect, and there are efforts already underway, but the severity of the problem doesn't seem to be properly understood. I mean, that to some degree speaks to the credit of the EU and the EU institutions. Say it actually matters to put effort into influencing what happens here, because it's not just for intellectual conversations, but that have these nations. You look at the Qatar Gate, you look at various other crises around. There was a European aspect to it, an important one. So it actually matters, great, but then let's take that seriously enough. And again, whether that's an institutional level with counterintelligence or whatnot, I'm no expert there, but give it the sufficient severity and attention that this has a massive, massive impact on Europe's very existence, ultimately. Maybe it's a bit dramatic, but ultimately it's not in the interest of a lot of countries that the EU exists, full stop. And let's take that seriously on its own.
But I have to say, I don't know how Sophia feels about it, but screening through the latest Eurobarometer data, it's on the one hand, it's interesting to see the defense and security has climbed up towards the top of people's priorities. So it's true that it comes, I think, after poverty, public health, and economy. So still, bread and butter issues still matter quite a lot for the general public. But then you have security and defense right up there, which probably was not the case. I don't have the data at hand at the moment, but was probably not the case prior to the war. So that's already a hint or a signal that it does matter and that people are aware. But I do think that it's interesting that it's not at the very top. And I do think that probably has to do also with the fact that you have an entire continent and some countries are closer to the conflict and have a different sense of perception about the risks than others who might be further away. So that's if I can add to the remark in that sense. Yeah. Sophia, I don't know if you maybe disagreed with it, but
I'm going to be really brief. On the cost of living, very briefly, what is interesting here is I think that some far-right parties in some member states are really capitalizing on that. And that while migration overall, I have the feeling, still is the main topic of most of those parties. We look at, if we look at the Netherlands and in Portugal, I mean, there migration played a minor role even compared to, right, the cost of living. And I mean, a lot of people, when you ask them afterwards, why did they vote for Wilders? They were like, yeah, but actually we don't want him as a prime minister. But the thing is, we had to send a signal because we are in a very difficult situation here. So that I think is telling. One sentence on foreign interference. You said that it's mainly on the very right and very left, but I want to say that foreign interference we see across the spectrum, right? I mean, the latest case was indeed from the AfD, from the far right, but I mean, we had a Greens from Estonia recently, right? I mean, all not proven as I understand it. Qatargate was around the S&D, right? I mean, so I don't think that this is a political camp which is particularly prone to be, you know, abused as spies or something. I mean, it's not good news that we see it across the spectrum. The European Parliament, however, is ready, very unequipped to answer to this, because yeah, there is no European intelligence service, and there is no way. I mean, the Parliament relies on the Belgian services, which, you know, do probably what they can, but you know, this is not enough. And so ahead of the EP elections, I think the European Parliament is very, very vulnerable for, and I suspect that more things like this will surface up.
Okay. Well, we've come basically at the end of our time together, but before we part ways, I wanted to be a little bit mean and see if we can, if I can ask you in 15 seconds, 30 seconds maximum to tell us one hope or one recommendation that you would have for the next leadership. Because Sophia just spoke. András, I come to you first.
I have 4 seconds to reflect on that.
Yes.
Maybe as a takeaway is not to be stuck in our Brussels bubble where we think we know what's best for the rest of the continent, but listen to the trends and priorities and voice overall of Europeans as diverse as they are, and shape European policies in a way that resonates with them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Levente?
Well, my hope is that my optimism.
The archaeologist.
My hope is that my optimism about the limited effect of the far right will not prove to be ill-founded. And I also recommend the centrist parties to find renewed incentives to work together and thus avert the potential crisis the rise of Eurosceptics might create. And so keep on going towards the European path. And for us to keep calm.
Yeah. My hope would be that the next Commission President, whoever it will be, would take the democracy and rule of law file more serious than the previous one.
Okay, very important key messages. Thank you so much for your very insightful comments, and also to your patience and to your questions. Please join me in thanking the speakers, and goodbye.
Thank you so much.